Welcome to our panellists. I'm Alina Bain. I'm CEO of the Australian Services Roundtable. We represent the services sector, which is as broad as it sounds, and according to Phil, it's even broader than I thought. So we may well adjust our mandate perhaps going forward. I think that might be an interesting conversation for me to take back to my board. The Australian Services Roundtable is very focused on the role that Australian services play within our economy, but more broadly within the region. We're the go-to for the government on matters of international trade, and so some of my questions and remarks will be through that lens. Before I press on with those opening remarks, I'd like to thank Kyle and her team at CEDA. This report certainly is very timely. The narrative from the government and the industry is very focused on services. Such a high proportion of GDP, 4 out of 5 people work in services, but yet there's a disconnect, if you like, between that narrative and what we within the bubble all know to be true, and messaging that back to those 4 out of 5 people. And chances are people who work in the services sector don't necessarily identify as being part of that 4 out of 5. They are, a lawyer or an engineer or an accountant. And there's certainly some work to be done in that space to demystify the services sector, and again to help the government truly understand what is happening in that sector, particularly those in the business-to-business space. But today we're going to focus on the health sector and the tourism sector, two very important sectors, both domestically and some interesting commentary internationally as well, which will be the focus of some of my questions. So for today, I've got a couple of questions which we can sort of get the panel warmed up on. We had a fantastic conversation over lunch, so plenty to share with you, but certainly we welcome your questions. We've got the experts here up on the stage, so please do make the most of it. And I do thank the panellists for joining us today. I think this is going to be a fantastic conversation, and certainly opened by Phil in his remarks and the change that we've seen within the Australian economy. But really importantly, again from the ASR perspective, is that the positioning of Australia within the region. And really it's been a fascinating, if not somewhat unsettling period, I would say, in the last 12 months. And my remarks now at events like this 12 months ago were very different. But now, of course, we're talking Brexit, their exit from the EU. We're talking the US, the Trump administration's exit from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, some closing in, I guess, and very much an anti-globalisation narrative, which, to Phil's point, is not sustainable. So the comments and the questions I have for the panel today are through that lens, and productivity and innovation being so very important to enable services firms to make the most of those international opportunities. And we are in a great situation, I think, in Australia. We're very multicultural. We're used to working either in Asia ourselves or alongside Asian colleagues here in Australia. So we're very well placed, I think, to differentiate ourselves from our colleagues across the Pacific and claim the role for Australia, particularly in the services space. I'm not sure that we're doing a good enough job of it at the moment, and certainly I think that burden falls both on government in terms of domestic policy and regulatory settings, but also there's an obligation on industry to grasp these opportunities and to lead the way. There's a communications piece that is missing to bring people along, to help them understand the services sector and the benefits of internationalisation. That story was lost. It was lost when we negotiated the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. We need to recast that debate. It's positive, notwithstanding the anti-globalisation sentiment. Services sector's ready to go, but they need help. both domestically and, of course, internationally. So with those opening remarks said, we do have a roving microphone here at the back there. If you could, when you take the microphone, identify yourself, your organisation, and then put your questions to the panel. So while you're warming up, I might just kick off, if that's all right. Ready to go, guys? Yep. Okay. And I'm the only woman up here, and I did forewarn the panellists about that. So we might talk about diversity, I think, in a little bit. Just in terms of the internationalisation piece, we have been very active in our free trade agreements, and they are very important. The former Trade Minister Andrew Robb signed off the 3 North Asia agreements, China, South Korea and Japan. And I'm interested to hear from the panellists in terms of their sectors and Phil more broadly of the benefits of internationalisation and those trade agreements to your sectors. What are you seeing and where are the opportunities and observations? And Rowan, perhaps for the health sector, you might like to kick off.
Yeah, I might, if I might, though, Alina, could I start somewhere just a little different on your point about why are these things not resonating in the way that they have to date? Because in past generations, one would have assumed that the achievement of those free trade agreements would have been broadly lauded and very well considered, and yet somehow or other, it's not resonating in our community in the same ways, and I think that's notable. I want to stress at the outset that I'm a perverse optimist about most of the sectoral involvements that I have, but there's a lot to be pessimistic about currently. But I think, notwithstanding that, we can push through. But I think the backdrop that we've got to acknowledge here is that our communities are anxious, and they're anxious in ways that are not responding to things like positive international trade agreements or other some such markers of potential positive general economic development. And for mine, it's a multi-factor, complex issue. I don't plan to try and fathom it all today, and it's not particularly my area. But I do submit that one very fundamental factor is that behind this anxiety is that we are in the midst of demographic change, which is a backdrop to anxiety, the like of which we have never seen before. We're in an Australia now where 400 people a day are turning 75 years old, and for all of human history, the population pyramid has been just that, a pyramid of some degree of angle. For the first time, the industrialised world is facing a population reality which is more like this. In that context, the anxiety of a growing proportion of our population in relation to service and care needs and retirement, income adequacy, etc., are rising massively. And in this, Australia is not alone. So we're the first human societies that have ever witnessed mass ageing, and we're going through that experiment at the moment. So I think that's a relevant backdrop. So how do we perhaps start rethinking some of our opportunities in a way that might both resonate with our communities, but also attend to your point, which is how do we ensure the continuing economic development of our nation? Insofar as health is concerned, we're a nation that spends about $160 billion per annum in aggregate across all payers on healthcare. On a recurrent basis, that's leaving capital aside, and that is growing at $10 billion nominally per annum, accelerating. So just the delta year on year across all payers is $10 billion, which, Phil, you'll correct me if I'm wrong here, I think was more than we allocated to real economic infrastructure in a particular year of the federal budget this year. That's a measure of how fast this thing is growing. And that's without going near aged care or community care needs and other things, or the capital account. Just witness Royal Adelaide Hospital and Perth's Children's. I'm glad I don't have an example from this fair state to offer you in that regard. So the capital account's a problem as well. But that money, those funds, those activities, that workforce, those clinical interventions, those interventions in people's well-being will occur, plus or minus, every year and grow. Now, we can make a virtue of that with one of the world's better health systems, or we can treat it as a continuing burden and we can feed the beast. I would argue that we should do the former, that we should actually think about how it is that we can treat this ongoing, demanded set of activities by an ageing population and invest in its capacity to be a truly valuable good in relation not just to our own community, but in terms of export and development in all sorts of ways.
Thank you. Andreas, in the tourist sector?
Yeah, so just in relation to the free trade agreement, I used to work at the Productivity Commission, and the funny thing about free trade agreements is that when most people think about them, they think about goods and services. Tariffs on goods and services in Australia are very, very close to zero or non-existent, and there are there's diminishing returns in there. So when we had to model back then how much would Australia gain from reducing them even further, we had to try really, really hard because they were so close to zero. The future is no longer in tariff reductions. It's actually in financial integration. It's in foreign direct investment, and because there the barriers are huge. And they always come in as a second thought to these FTAs. Most of the time when their negotiators sit down, they think about goods and service flows. The really important stuff is the flow of investment across borders. Australia is doing very well relative to its regional neighbours, but for us it's really important to make this point to our regional neighbours that we should stop focusing so much on goods and services flows and think more about the financial flows as well as the migratory flows, because they're really important when we think about combating skill shortages, which are really important for the service sector, and improving regional integration.
Phil?
If I can add to that, picking up on your point, Andrews, Australia trades very heavily in Asia, but it doesn't trade financially in Asia that much. Our capital expenditure, if we're investing abroad, goes into Europe and the United States predominantly. And that's true of my own company for different reasons, though, because I'm an online database company and Asia doesn't spend much money on information yet. And they won't until they get over $25,000 per capita. There's just no market there. We're in China, but only because we export all the China data to the rest of the world. So Asia's a very good place for trade. It's not always been ready for capital expenditure to be absorbed. To some extent also the corruption levels in some countries have been a deterrent, and that scares a lot of executives from making the decision to go there. There's no way you can go into almost any country in Asia without being involved in some level of corruption, however low. I mean, we were in Indonesia for a while, but I mean, you just drive your car down there and if you're a white face, you're going to get booked for doing 15 kilometres an hour and they say you're doing 100. You can either go to court, which takes you up a day, or you pay out $10 and they get, leave you alone. That sort of thing is corruption, and it goes from the top to the bottom. So until corruption goes and until it becomes ready for some of the capital, it's going to be a little bit slower than our trade. Tourism, though, I think, coming back to your point, Linda, I think it's very important. I think the most important thing about tourism is it's a way of establishing friends between countries. I don't think we should ever forget that. And people would rather be friends before they trade, and they'd rather trade before they do anything else anyway. But I think the point about that is that, first of all, we earn about $46 billion out of external tourism at the moment. In other words, tourists coming in. But to do that, we've only got 1% of the Chinese tourists each year. Currently, China has about 110 million tourists leaving their shores each year. We get just 1% of that. Now, if we got 10%, and that's not asking too much, plus the normal growth, we'd be trebling that 46 up to about 130. And I don't think asking for 10%, I'd ask for 15. By the time we get to 15% of China, plus some of India, we're exporting more than all of our minerals put together, because currently mineral exports are around about 170 billion. We can easily beat that just with tourism alone. And it's a bit sad to see tourism being so low in productivity in this report, because it's got to get a lot better than that. But I think that even before the efficiency comes in, I think we've got to get a much better job done on marketing into Asia than we're doing at the present time. I just don't think I don't think we've done a good job since Paul Hogan, actually, and that was to attract the Yanks. We need a Paul Hogan to attract the Asians, and because we've just got just about everything you'd want here, you know, depending on what time of the year. So I think that's the other thing about tourism. It's a friendship thing. The great risk with Asia, and the reason why it's a difficult region to bring together, is the differences between the countries in Asia are far greater than the differences in standard of living and cultures in Europe or North America. In North America, you've only got the Canadians, the Americans, and the Mexicans. There's not too much difference there. In the EU, there's a few they shouldn't have invited in because they were too low, but it's pretty close. But in Asia, you've got everything from dirt poor countries, and the other thing to remember too is that many of them are run by dictators, of course, or non-democratic systems, beginning with China, of course, and Vietnam, probably in the Philippines at the moment on that one, but with Duterte. But I think we've got to understand that Asia is not a homogenous group coming together in the same way that the EU or North America can come together. It's very disparate, and I think those free trade agreements, which I agree are very marginal in their impact, you're dead right on that, nevertheless, probably is the only way you're going to pull them together, because to assume that they're all somewhat equal is not true. It's just not true. So anyway, 2 bobs worth.
Thank you. Fantastic. I might just move to, I hope you're thinking of good questions, move to the offshoring of jobs, which is referred to quite extensively in the report. And I think, Rowan, to your point, there is a high level of anxiety around use of technology leading to innovation, and that we're going to see jobs moving offshore, and what is that going to mean for people. And certainly I think we all need to do a better job to bring people along with us. But I'm looking for some observations from you about skills here within Australia, about bringing in, where there's a skills shortage, bringing in from overseas, and how you see that benefiting the productivity of your respective industries. Of course, recently we've seen changes to the 457 visas, so I would welcome a point of view on that as well, either in terms of the detail or globally. So Andreas, in the tourism sector?
Yeah, so the tourism sector is a bit of a contrast to health, because the majority of jobs in tourism are in SMEs. I think about 18 to 19% of jobs in the services is in the tourism sector. Of those, about 50% are in SMEs, where the business is less than 10 people. So we are talking about SMEs, and the productivity issue in that kind of environment is very, very different from what you might have in health systems and the financial sector. In terms of skill shortages, we did a study across the APEC region, including China and America and South America and Asia. And what we see, the issue is that with digitization and this kind of impact on the type of jobs that are available, we're going to have some jobs going, obviously, but there's going to be massive skill shortages in others. So the big question for us is, how do we manage getting the human resources to where they're needed the most? So let me give you just a simple example. This is not in Australia, but for part of this study, I had to go to Papua New Guinea. And in Papua New Guinea, there was a hotel in Kokopu, and what you had is all the staff were Papua New Guineans, but when I was talking to the hotel manager, he mentioned that the cook who cooks the Papua New Guinean food and the accountant who runs the hotel had to be brought in from the Philippines or India. And, as an outsider, you can look at that and go, well, obviously we have an education training issue here. And Australia does a good job with providing skills certification, especially in tourism. But we still have, I think, a bit more to go in terms of getting people to develop career pathways where you have an industry where there's a lot of staff in unskilled areas, and giving them an idea about the career pathways that are available to the critical areas. And that's a huge problem, because jobs in tourism are very large, but there tends to be quite a lot of underinvestment in training, because we're talking about SMEs. These guys are seasonal. They are surviving from one season to the next. And we can learn a lot from other countries about how to develop the right ecosystem where we can get those people up the value chain. This is really important for two reasons. One is that 60% of the workforce in tourism is female, so it helps, we were talking about gender equity, and also that the skill shortages will really hit labour productivity because the tourism sector is not in a position to compete with other sectors for your ITs and your accountants. But they have this huge pool of workers at the bottom who they could maybe guide to there. So their turnover costs are going to go up. They're not going to be able to compete with other service sector for these kind of skilled labour. So what they need to start thinking about is the long game, about getting people working at the bottom of the food chain and moving them up through skills and education.
That's quite an interesting way to look at it. We do have, we've got a question here, but Rowan, just quickly on the labour point, and then I'll take your question.
Sure. Look, I think the point about 457 visas is an example of, governments in some ways, I think, reflecting the confusion and anxiety of the population. And what do we do about that? But just, in relation to the healthcare and adjacent arenas such as aged care and the disability care environment, returning again to the theme of demography, we are going to become very much more dependent on the formal care workforce over the next several years. So the dirty secret of many areas of the human services care arena is that the informal care workforce has done a disproportionate and unrecognised and lowly valued job, and of course it was largely women and remains largely women. But that workforce is ageing, it is shrinking, it itself needs care, and for various reasons it is going to be replaced by, because of volume issues, it is going to be replaced by a formal care workforce. That is a material at-large economic effect, but it's also a social effect in all sorts of ways. And in regard to your point on immigration and workforces from offshore, on Phil's chart, it was apparent there before that the largest single sector by employment in Australia is now health and social assistance. Now, it crested retail and construction about 3 to 4 years ago as the largest employer group, and it is growing massively. Over 3 years or so, 3 or 4 years, that sector will have added the net total of the mining sector jobs, full stop. Right? So let's think about this in terms of volume and apples and bananas and so on. So when we as a community go to look for hopefully productive systems, but including workforces, and we are going to need to bring, let's call it 300,000 workers. That's a very, very large number, 300,000 workers in the formal care workforce to bear in our marketplace just to account for the implied labour requirements of the NDIS over the next 3 to 4 years. Full stop. One factor alone. If we're having a conversation now about limiting our access to global labour markets, we could be headed in the wrong direction.
Agreed. Totally agree.
Yeah. Thank you, Rowan. Question down the back here.
Hello, Bernd Neubauer, Manager of Economic Development at Redland City Council. Thank you for all the comments and feedback. Phil, I've been a fan of you for quite some time. So,
Thank you.
Yeah. My comments are more a challenge rather than a question. When are organisations such as the Australian Services Roundtable going to focus on marketing themselves as smart services? When is the manufacturing industry, although Queensland's doing a pretty good job of this, of marketing itself, its future in advanced manufacturing? So it's the smart skills. It's what you said, Phil, in relation to services is wrapped around everything we do. But there's a little bit of a culture within the manufacturing industry that manufacturing is dead. Manufacturing's not dead. If you're a niche provider, a niche supplier, you can kick some really big goals. So there's a bit of a marketing sort of element to my question that I'd be interested to see how the panellists, more locally in the Redland City Council, again, I guess there's a little bit of a marketing element to it because I've only just been there 2 months and it has a pretty healthy aged care sector. So one end of the marketing end is, the Redlands is where you go to die. The flip side is that we've done some analysis and understanding and even spoken to some Vice-Chancellors that we've got an opportunity for a centre of excellence in learning for the aged care sector. So actually generating skilled people, not just for Australia, but for overseas. So a couple of different elements to it, but brought it back to local. But I think the marketing side, it needs to become part of the narrative. I mean, 2 weeks ago I was here for the Bris Makers Fest and there was a Swedish academic and he'd been in Australia for about 2 years. He said, in Australia everybody's saying manufacturing is dead. Well, it's not dead. Smart manufacturing is alive.
Well, maybe given Phil, you're a big fan, let's go to Phil on that one. Some observations on the marketing piece.
I'll be fairly quick on that. First of all, you're right. I mean, smart manufacturing, I think already the Advanced Manufacturing Council's identified close to 2,000 manufacturers that would fit that definition of smart. Some of them doing spare parts for American cars, because they're doing carbon fibre wheels, down in Geelong, and we're doing bits for propellers that go into jet planes, and there's about 2,000 of them, but if you add them all up, of the just under 6% of GDP from manufacturing, they're probably less than 1%. They might make their money more out of their intellectual property than they will out of manufacturing here. In other words, if they're that smart, it's not dissimilar to us. We're considered the world's most advanced industry analytical firm. We are, and we're the biggest in the world too, but we treat that as an IP thing that we take around the world rather than export everything from here, because if we're going to cover all the German industries, we go to Germany with our smarts. So I think to some extent the advanced manufacturing may be more valued in its IP than its export or manufacturing potential here. The second thing I think about manufacturing though, how on earth did we ever lose steel manufacturing when all the raw materials are here? Which means we didn't have enough smarts to do it right. My prediction is that steel will come back into Australia and we probably will be the world's largest steel manufacturing company sometime around the middle of this century. It won't be owned by Australians, it'll be owned by the Chinese, because they'll just write out a cheque for whatever it takes in those days, maybe $15 billion or $100 billion, doesn't matter. They will put the money in and they'll do it right. It won't add much to our employment because everything will be mechanised at that stage. So we're talking volumes and export dollars, and they're very, very valuable, don't get me wrong, but they won't employ very many people. When we go back and do manufacturing very cleverly, like we should have always done it, but we didn't, because of protectionism and all sorts of things, it'll be a problem. The second problem we've got is having the balls, oops, I shouldn't use that word, to put in the dollars.
A bit late.
Sorry, I've done it now. And the same problem exists in manufacturing as it does in agriculture. Agriculture is starting to go through a revolution now, but it's going to be foreign money, unless it's our mining magnates like Fortescue and Gina Reinhardt with hers, where they're used to writing out cheques for $1 billion. That's what agriculture has to do. The days of the small farm turning over less than $500,000 a year and taking out 65,000 on a good year is gone. So who's going to build the $2 billion stage 2 of Ord River? It'll be the Chinese. They'll write a cheque out. You can wait till hell freezes over before we'll do it. Our mines aren't big enough to handle that. And I think therein lies one of our great long-term challenges, which is not only on productivity, but what goes into making a great nation. We're just not thinking long enough and big enough. For example, we've only got 24.5 million people. That's enough people to touch hand to hand around the coastline, just, including Tasmania, thank God for them. Indonesia, next door neighbour, has got enough people to stand 11 deep around Australia, and China 56. Now, the point is we're the most underpopulated nation in the whole of Asia. That didn't matter for the last 300, 500, 60,000 years because nobody knew we were here. Everybody knows where we are now and what we've got, or nearly will do, thank God to the communications. which means I think some of the issues that Rowan's brought up about the 457 visas and all the rest would go even deeper than that. You see, 24.5 million, there are 7 cities in Asia bigger than that. Cities, not countries, 7 cities. China can build a 24.5 million city in roughly 7 years. That's all it takes them. They've done that. You know, our minds aren't big enough to cope with that at the moment, and it's why we will have to move to that Eurasian and Asian standard, because our minds aren't capable of handling these tasks. So that I think, in a sense, until we get somebody that's got the vision and can give us the perspective as a nation, we're just going to pretend we're still part of the old European or even the old American scene, and we're not. Those days are gone.
I'll give you one positive thought on that, though, Phil. I mean, we could change the architecture of our $2 trillion, no, I'm not talking about direction, I'm talking about broad architecture, of our $2 trillion pool of superannuation.
That's true.
Yes.
In order that we might at least support longer term vision.
I agree with that.
And
If we
a
can do
different framework. And I'm not talking about picking winners or being policy directive. I'm talking about absolute architecture.
I think the other
There's
thing.
1,002 trillions in that too, 2 billions in that. So
We
you're
might
right.
just, Andreas, by all means, but we've got a question here.
Oh,
So
sorry.
Yeah,
please
I'll make a quick comment.
Yeah.
The other thing we should think about is getting our sovereign wealth funds issue really well thought out. If there is the next commodity boom, I think Australia kind of missed the boat on how to make the most out of that. And especially in Queensland, there are still sort of, we have learnt lessons about how to handle a mining boom from a regulatory, from a financial, from a long-term perspective. But there's still a lot to be done in order for us to try and remember those for the next time around, because there's going to be another one.
Yes, there will.
And hopefully we'll do a better job of capturing that for long-term planning.
Yes, and I think the rapid rate of change is a challenge for all of us, and goodness knows how government, with all due respect, is going to keep up with us on that. But we have a question down the front here.
Oh, thank you. Ros Walker from the Community Services Industry Alliance. So it's sort of the social services end of the health and social services category. I suppose my broad question to the panel is, how do we start to better align efficiency and effectiveness in human services? We are trying to move from an input-output based approach to outcomes with varying degrees of success. The NDIS, I suppose, demonstrates that often an outcomes-based approach doesn't quite sit well with efficient pricing. And I think part of that is because we don't and haven't really articulated that unique nature of human service transactions. And I suppose also that it is a unique market in the fact that there are government controls around funding, and contracting very much dominated by government funding at this point, with limited sort of, I suppose, ability to innovate or seek additional funding from other sources. So I suppose, yes, in terms of aligning efficiency and effectiveness in human services, I'd just like to hear some commentary from the panel as to how you might align those two better in this the contemporary environment.
I'd suggest Rowan have a go at that one.
Look, thank you. That's an enormous and important topic. And the issues of, for example, in relation to the NDIS, which the Productivity Commission is again grappling with currently, having been given another reference from the government to reflect on how is this market developing, with that key concern at the centre. Interestingly, the reference was made for cost versus effectiveness, and whether that in some ways reveals our thinking and our anxiety. But look, more generally, I think it's going to sound boring, but I do think measurement is the way forward here. And when I say measurement, I'm talking about some of the actually new worlds that are available to us from the new technologies, where we can now actually start to deal with solving for multi-factor assessments that were uncomputable just 10 years ago. But now they're not just computable, we can seek to optimise them. So just to give you a for instance, one with 198 zeros behind it is the number of possible variant routes that the average UPS driver has on an average day in North America as a choice of delivering their packages. That's a very large number. Then there are 50,000 or so such UPS drivers. So you multiply 198 zeros and 50,000 such drivers, and just think about how big that set of variables is. It was knowable in the sense that we could describe the number, like we could describe the distance to the sun, but we couldn't do anything with it. Now, what does UPS do? They not only have that number in, they also have about 35 sensors on those vans to check optimised time between seatbelt on and off, reversing time, advancing time, left-right time, speeds above X, speeds below Y, N, fuel performance. So these numbers just keep getting bigger, and then they're not just calculating it, they're optimising it, and they're now starting to use it by way of service quality delivery. So, long excursus, but back to for instance, in human service delivery, we can now start thinking about some of the aspects of human service delivery in whole new ways. And we can start thinking about its inherent productivity qualities in quite different ways. And so we can have much richer possible understandings of the effectivenesses of outputs and things like references to, if it's a care service, how effective is escalation, what are the mean times between Z and Y, and all those sorts of things. These things weren't available to us before, but that's why I'm making the submission v healthcare in this report, that this is why business model innovation, not procedural or molecular or technological per se innovation, is potentially so valuable. So, I think on your point, there's an enormous amount of things to say, but I do think sensible adult conversations about how we measure this, develop the measurement of the sector's outputs and amenity and quality is a field that must be readdressed.
If I could add to that, I think one of the challenges health faces on that area of that is who pays, because if it's not market-driven, we've got a problem going forward. Now, since 1901, when we federated, the households pay 1/3 of the total health bill, which is, Rowan's already said, you look at 160 billion plus without taking capital expenditure into account. About 1/3 of that's paid for by directly, and the other 2/3 through our taxes. Now, if that's going to go from 160 billion incidentally represents about almost 10% of the economy, not quite. America's already up to 16. We probably all are going to head towards 20 by the end of this century anyway, because health's going to be a high priority compared to anything else, and the rest of the goods and services are going to become cheaper anyway, so we can afford it. I think more the question of efficiency comes into who's paying, because if it's all going to be government through our taxes, you can assume the productivity is going to be bloody close to zero, like everything else that government runs. That's the nature of the beast. So I think the question is, how do we, if you like, arm the household with the ability to make it competitive?
Yeah. And if I could make a point on just that, and I think in response to your question as well, Phil made a point earlier that seemingly there was an efficiency measure in terms of productivity improvements in healthcare, which was somehow near average, but that's deeply deceptive. Because, for instance, we might be getting much better at more efficiently doing, say, a knee arthroscopy, right, for someone with incipient osteoarthritis. The fact that we shouldn't be doing that, right, is a problem, right? So we're measuring the efficiency of a useless expenditure, right? So, these are the things about proper measurement becoming more sensitive. So therefore, artefacts like, again, I know I'm talking healthcare rather than community care, but in healthcare, really important developments like the National Safety and Quality Commission's atlas of unwarranted variation in Australian healthcare, where we know that someone's 20 times off the standard deviation for this application of this procedure. We haven't had that data before. We've just now started to get it. Those sorts of artefacts will help us.
Okay. We might need to, I think, bring things to a close in terms of the Q&A. I think we could probably spend the afternoon over a glass of red continuing this conversation. I know I would like to. It's been fascinating. Over to Carl.